Good afternoon, Björn. First of all, I wanted to thank EFMD, Academy by Rima 1, for organizing this series of webinars. So this is the third. We're going to speak about teaching effectiveness, and we have with us Björn Kjellander from Jönköping University. Hey, Björn.
Hey.
So Björn, could you maybe introduce yourself and what you're doing in Jönköping?
Well, I'm Björn Kjellander. Björn, incidentally, means bear in Swedish. For some interesting information to start with, I work as a Director of Quality and Accreditation. I have been doing this since, 2010. I'm also a member of faculty, so I have a PhD from the University of Sussex in entrepreneurship history. I'm now also involved in local research here on entrepreneurship, ownership, and family business. So I started out working as a director back in 2010, firstly on a 10% basis, and then it's quickly moved up to a full-time job. So nowadays I mostly do research on the side and devote basically full-time, at least since 2015, only to quality assurance processes and working with our EQUIS and AACSB accreditations.
Thank you, Björn. So just to remind everybody, we're really keen on getting questions from you. So the chat is there, so please feel free to ask questions as much as possible. The format of the webinar is really a discussion between Björn and myself, and I have a few questions for Björn, but if you have questions, I'm happy to pass them on to Björn. And this is really peer-to-peer, so it's really Björn, the vision of Björn of how he's doing things in his institution and trying to bring best practice. For the purpose, in the title of the webinar, we're talking about teaching effectiveness. We agree with Björn that it would be easier to talk about AOL for assurance of learning. So today we will talk about assurance of learning rather than teaching effectiveness, but it's just to ease the discussion. So Björn, the first question is, what is AOL for you?
Oh, for me? Oh, well, it's been following me actually since 2010, and it's been always a bit of a moving target. It's something that we try to ascertain through various education philosophies and mechanisms. It's usually something that is asked for by our external observers, such as national agencies or international accreditors. Grudgingly, in higher education, we of course, well, unlike businesses, we are not used to an actual outside-in perspective. So we try to adopt and adapt to, depending on who's asking about what is assurance of learning for you, how do you ascertain that students are learning. This is, of course, even more complicated for us as an international business school, where we have students coming from all over the world, meaning that the content and balance of the knowledge, skills, abilities, competencies that incoming students have with them in their academic rucksacks very much depend on where they are coming from. So AOL is looked upon very differently also depending on where students come from. And when I really started to work hard with QM and QA work linked to AOL, it was back in 2015 when we tried to build up organic and sustainable enough QM and QA systems to address these varying external expectations. We don't have the perfect system yet, I think, to meet and ascertain assurance of learning, but I think we certainly more closer than we were before, when I think we're at best reach assurance of assessment that we could garnish with evidence of learning. So AOL, again, it's a moving target. It's something we're constantly working with, but I think that we are more now systematically and more organically are following up.
Thank you. So just as a side note for the people that might know you, so Jönköping University is AACSB accredited, and you just got reaccredited EQUIS and your 5-year EQUIS. You just mentioned that international accreditation were really the reason why you were going to build your AOL system. There's also national accreditation that are going to ask for you, but for you, it's really the international accreditation. And both AACSB and EFMD are talking about AOL, not in the same terms. You have for AACSB AOL, and for EFMD, you're going to have the notion of ILOs. How do you link your two processes together in order to make sure that you have something which is done once and you don't have to readdress it for each accreditation?
Yeah. At first, it may seem that they are very different, right? But both AOL and ILOs are really look at the way that schools ascertains how students meet the program individual learning objectives. I think overall is that EFMD looks more at the school's quality assurance processes, look more at program and course assessment regimes, rigidity, that they complement, particularly during visits, then by extensive course samplings. Whereas AACSB puts a greater emphasis on particularly tabled evidence of learning and measurable outcomes on a program level. In pedagogy, I think it would be phrased that EFMD balances formative and cumulative learning more than AACSB, who still puts more focus on cumulative learning in their assessment philosophy. So ultimately, with a good system, you can use the same vernacular, the same QM systems to address both expectations from both AACSB and EFMD, even though they move on for EFMD both on program and course level, and AACSB foremost on a program level. And
so you're talking about process that you put in place. Could you maybe describe the process that you have put in place in Jönköping?
For the measurement of AOL, for example.
For AOL in general, for the mapping part, for the measuring. We heard from Thomas, from Adam and Julie last week about different aspects of how to engage your faculty, how to think strategy. So for AOL, how did you put it in place, and how did you get people to agree on it and to work with you on it?
Well, when we started, as the case is often, it starts with an internal process often. Back in 2010, and I'm still going back to 2010, we kept A1 size ledgers with the program by program ILOs. We worked a lot in Excel, where we kept all the program goals listed, and it wasn't really something that we could share with faculty. There was no systemized ways, there was no shared database where we can show faculty how AOL worked. So it was very much the top management thing. But as we got into, in 2014, we had 2 EPAS visits, where we also have to maintain ledgers with sample student results. Yeah, so we kept really thick files. Then came the Swedish Higher Education Authority's National Assessment 2011-14. That was running at the same time as the EPAS visits, and then the AACSB and EQUIS visits in 2015, where we got double accredited. This really forced us to look into our QM and QA systems and processes, including how can we reach economies of scale when it comes to AOL, and also how can we make AOL an integral part of faculty activities, of our day-to-day activities. We were really prompted and forced by our ambitions to start sharing AOL and share the burden of AOL. So it didn't end up in a lonely Excel file, on an opera management floor. It was something that should be operationalized and shared with the faculty. So what we also did was that we got a good database solution, Academ, back in 2016, where we tried to put all our QM into quality management, our research repository system, but also assurance of learning. And that enabled us also to involve faculty in the database and make them part of a quality chain. So it was much more easy then when you had a hub to involve everybody and in the natural roles as examiners, as program directors, as program group members, that you have one place where they could involve, and we really like to see it as a plan, do, check, act system. I think that's what we finally achieved by having a joint database and trying to involve people more in the natural roles. And I probably should say some more about that later into this discussion about the other measures we did, but that's mostly linked to the actual measurement, direct and indirect. Yeah.
We got a first question on AOL and COVID, but I'll keep it for a bit later, because like we're talking about how you installed everything, and when you're thinking AOL, you're thinking about learning goals, learning objectives, and you're thinking about aligning everything to the mission of your institution. So how do you do that? Do you have like best practice tooltip that you did in order to align everything?
Well, as part of the curriculum review processes that we established and basically digitalized, every program needs to contain a stipulated number of mission-related goals. I mean, what's very typical for the Nordic countries is that the degree goals are stipulated in law. So you need to cover a number of generalized goals, degree goals, that are linked to knowledge, skills, and abilities. So that they need to be included in every program syllabus. And they take up a lot of space in terms of goals. So you end up with maybe 10, 11 goals, generic ones to start with, that needs to be interpreted on a discipline level. In addition to that, though, we have a number of mission-related goals that are also run through our AOL processes, and they are followed up in the same way as our other program goals. So again, we are not following up our mission-related goals separately, but it's integrated with how we follow up the PGs overall and what we need to report to the, well, for example, the Swedish higher education authorities in Stockholm.
Björn, a question linked to that from Florence is, as Director of Quality and Accreditation, how do you link teaching effectiveness to AOL or EFMD requirements?
Teaching effectiveness to AOL, well, AOL, assurance of learning, is linked to indirect and direct measures. And of course, an example of indirect measure would be, of course, course evaluations or program evaluations. It could be program exit surveys. It could be alumni program data. So that's a way to indirectly link teaching effectiveness. In our program exit surveys, they are usually, since they are leaving the university, quite generous with the comments about courses that they've been taking, and so that's a good way to pick up signals from from the graduating students, and also, I mean, we are very in this age, we are very focused. Well, we are not very focused on delayed gratification. So we expect the students to know immediately after the course if they thought the course was good or not, or beneficial. But I think that's, of course, a legal right of the students to be able to do that. But I think it's almost even more important to pick up signals from the graduating students, because then they spend an X number of years at the university and have matured more in their learning, and go back and reflect on what went well and where we can make improvements, including teaching effectiveness. So for us, I mean, the program exit service are a very good resource also for teaching effectiveness that we couple with the signals we get immediately after the courses. Then of course we have program groups, which includes current students, where students who are deep in the programs give continuous feedback. But we also have program advisory boards, which contain alumni who can then give input on curriculum and program syllabus, and they of course also have a tested these skills and competencies and knowledge that we gave them in practice based on where they ended up. So they can also give us a more of a longitudinal input on our teaching effectiveness.
You're talking about direct and indirect measures. Could you give us a vision of, for you in your institution, what is the correct number of direct, indirect? How do you balance the two? Do you have more direct? Do you have more indirect measures? What is for you the right amount?
Well, I mean, there's not a right amount, I think. What we've done is that we use direct measures in our annual program quality reports, what we call QRs. So we follow up each program goal once a year. And this is a process that is led by our program directors. So we get closing the loop results, to use AACSB vernacular, every year. This results, the report forms the basis for an analysis and reflection of the program director, where he and she have to write up a program, but also school level quality improvement plan. When he or she does that, they need to mix the direct measure results, but also the indirect measures we get from the previously mentioned program exit surveys, alumni program data. So whether it's a good mix or not, I don't know, but I think it's important that you use both, because the direct measures, it's like you put the shovel in the ground and you see how the program and course is doing right now, right after the course, right? But in order to get a picture of how students learn over time, I think it's important with this exit service and alumni follow-up reports. And that is the basis. This QRs and quality improvements plan gives us a lot of back and front office data and information that really forms the basis how we respond to both the expectations from the university, of course, because we need to be relevant and give input to the university quality assurance systems. It's also the basis for how we respond to national and international expectations. So I think there's no good answer on exactly how much you need, but it should be good enough for, in our case, the program director to really reflect on what kind of quality improvement that needs to be done, and also reflect on the ongoing work of the quality improvements. So it can always become better. I mean, we also, of course, have a lot of good data on, if our students get jobs and if they get jobs in which sectors. And sometimes you get a really big surprise when you design a program and most of the students end up somewhere else. So what does that say about what we put in their rucksack? How quick do they get this job? And what kind of salaries do they get? And students
Björn,
nowadays...
You're giving a lot of example, but could you maybe give us example of what kind of measure are direct measure and what kind of measures are indirect measures? Like if you had to list a few of direct or indirect, could you give us some examples?
Well, I mean, a direct measure is anything that happens in a course, really. I mean, it's the various tests in a course.
Yeah, but how do you do it then? So it's the exam during the course. It's a final paper. Like that's direct measurement, right?
Yes, exactly. And here's another interesting thing with assessment. We have moved away from a lot, at least, from exams and of course exams, and now looking at more progressive assessment, meaning that students submit material pieces, reflections, where they not only show a lot of knowledge but also competence and skills during the course. So we have a more segmented assessment. This is, of course, gives a lot of challenges when it comes to that when it comes, we are very used to measuring knowledge, right, in terms of direct measures. But how do you measure skills? I mean, so once you got a skill, once you can run that bicycle, isn't that always an A then, or is it a B? So it also gives us challenges, these various kinds of assessment or continuous assessment to grading. So that's, so even if I really like this more progressive learning, it gives us also challenges in terms of how do we assess this? And how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you separate distinction from, just good or poor? So what used to be mostly end of course exams is now so much more, which really ultimately have made it easier for me to explain to faculty the importance of rubrics, assessment matrices that were hard to make faculty subscribe to, as an idea, and they didn't know how to do them really. So now it comes more natural because now they need to keep more codified track of student learning, as it's now continuous assessment. So direct measures now could be a lot of things, but I do encourage everybody to use, matrices for it. And that of course makes it easy also for me to collect data for AOL for the various purposes.
There is a question from Melvin, naturally it's linked to one of the questions I had for you as well. How did you go about convincing the program directors to agree to use AOL data as part of the program evaluation process? And I will go even further, I'll say program directors, but how also do you involve the faculty? Because at the end, you will need the faculty involvement as well. So how did you go to first convince the director of programs and then the faculty themselves?
Well, I started by making a lot of mistakes. For example, when I was looking for a good definition of scholarly academic, now picking somewhere else, not AOL, but it's something, these acronyms are as strange to faculty as AOL, right? I asked for input by our research faculty board and basically took them half a year to agree what scholarly means. Because for them, scholarly equaled always a PhD. And normally, at least European business schools think, yes, the scholarly activity should be done by a PhD, but how do we handle faculty who do scholarly activities who don't have a PhD? So these discussions took a long time. And for AOL, same thing here, it was a terminology that, well, the kind of knee-jerk reaction I got was, I don't recognize this, it must be something wrong with it. Because change, it's not something that naturally comes to people in general, and certainly not to us academics. So the way I started was by involving program directors by sending them to various seminars to create a common language by, with people who work with education. So we could share an understanding what we meant with the different, technical words that, that goes with EQUIS, so that goes with EPAS, or that goes with AACSB. We started early with EPAS. So we had a number of faculty for whom they knew what this language meant. And very often it was basically a different description of something that they were doing anyway, but they hadn't codified it. So early by sending faculty to various conferences, seminars, but then later on really try to work the AOL into daily operations. So engaging faculty with assurance of learning in their natural roles, they're in their responsibilities, functions, and different roles in the systems, and that, as in our case, an examiners, directors of studies, program directors, program group members, program advisory boards. When you integrate assurance of learning as something organically in your own system, as part of what we do, it's much easier to explain what it means, right? So if the system in itself explains what AOL is, it doesn't become something that you show anecdotal evidence of every 5th year, you know, when you have a visit and you're trying to make faculty use AACSB or EQUIS vernacular. But it becomes partly what you do, because you have explained, or rather you have operationalized the terminology. So what was seen,
and how do you because that was when you were starting the process. Now, if you get a new program director that is not coming from inside the school, but from elsewhere, how do you train them on what you have built?
Well, I mean, they invite yours truly to the induction seminars. So we basically have an entire web page dedicated to our assurance of learning processes. And there we explain exactly how we explain the different components in the system and how it relates to our various accreditations. And then I spend a lot of time explaining it to our new employees, so they are inducted into the system from day one. So they don't come with a culture which is resistant to accreditation, but they actually come with they are coming to us because we are accredited, right? So it's also a question of culture change, because as you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, you know, changing the culture takes longer time, but with the new incoming faculty who thinks accreditation is great, and one of the reasons why are there, you can make use of them. Also, when you want to change the culture and make faculty start to think about AOL in a positive way, and let them work as, you know, examples of what it really means. So in addition to have basically show how your system works, show how your QA works, have an informational web page, make use of new faculty, because that creates momentum for change. But also, of course, as I did early, you need to identify the movers and shakers among faculty. You know, who are the people that faculty listen to? Who will they follow, right? I mean, we teach students about this, leadership, right? So I early on identify the people who I think could create change agents. And then particularly, I convinced to go to various seminars and conferences so they can come back and talk about it. And that was far more effective than me preaching on stage every week. But it was something that more over time was built from within. But of course, this is not something that should be done every 5th year, because a lot of things happen in 5 years or 3 years, depending on your accreditation status. So it's much better to build this into a system, really, or build system and codify this.
There is a few questions that came up on the measure. So I'm going to go back a little in time, Björn. Sorry about that, but got a question from Amizan. What kind of measurements tool that can be used to measure the impact of program/learning outcomes on business community/society?
Well, I would say it's a tricky one to measure business influence. I mean, I think what you should, again, the important thing with assurance of learning is not that it's assurance of assessment. I mean, in this 10 years, I've seen some great systems of assessments, but the important thing is, where do you take it? So in our case, the important thing is that we share the quality report with external stakeholders. So you can measure in terms of that you can show that you've shown our external stakeholders how students are doing, what kind of competencies they get, where they end up, what they work with, and then you should really try to get as much input from alumni, your corporations, companies, depending on where you come from and where your business school is situated. So you know, and you can check that you are teaching the students things that they will be able to make use of as they leave your school. The way this is measured for us is it's not in a table, really, but we can show that the program director, who is the program's engineer, gets this information and input, and that it will influence our curriculum review processes and how we work with making the programs relevant. That, I think, it's important, rather than putting it in numbers, that you create circumstances where your content goals are calibrated.
Thank you. Another question from Divya. When collecting AOL data, is the interpretation of what is an ABC for any given rubric set centrally, or does each participating faculty member have to explain how exactly they're different between the different level of achievement in their evaluation?
Well, rubrics are not set centrally unless we're talking thesis. I mean, and this is another quirk of Nordic countries. In order to get any degree, you need to write a big thesis, 15 to 30 credits. Those rubrics are joined for all programs, and I got the responsibility of writing up and coordinating this with all programs. So I personally put in a lot of work in creating those rubrics. So they are central indeed. As for other courses, they all need to create rubrics. So it's an examiner's responsibility to create rubrics and be able to show the students how they can get a certain grade, right? And what kind of, and they also need to have very distinct descriptors for each grade. And I'm not talking about the course grade now, but the assignment. So each assignment needs to have its own rubric. Now, I could, of course, author the rubrics of every single course, but then the idea of why we use rubrics would be coming from me, from Senkrecht von oben, and it shouldn't really, because we should build into our school's culture that, of course, every examiner should create a rubric. These rubrics are shared, of course, with everyone else, so anybody can go to the course page and look at the rubric. And often we invite faculty where we've seen, this is really good practice, how you assess these particular skills. We sort of share it with other examiners, at our teaching days. So I think for us, it's important that it comes from below and up, rubrics and best practice. Because if they were coming from above, examiners would stop writing rubrics, right?
Yeah.
So try to build a culture and keep track of that. Everybody do them, though. That's my job also. That I also check if we really have them in all courses. But we don't really decide how they should look like, except for thesis.
There's an example also. We work with some institution in China that have huge cohort of students. So they have compulsory courses, but there's such a big number that the same class is going to be taught by 4 or 5 different faculty. And the way they have done it for their AOL process was to define that the evaluation criteria of each of the course depend on the faculty. So each faculty can define their own criteria, because they're not teaching the course exactly the same way, because maybe one is going to use more PowerPoint slides, the other is going to use a technical lab. So depending on the way they're teaching, they're going to also be able to evaluate. And then the quality director is in charge of making sure that all of the evaluation criteria are aligned in order to have students going with Professor A or Professor B and having exactly the same experience.
Exactly. I think that's a much better role for somebody like me, for example, to make sure that it happens, basically, to observe that it happens. But the exact phrasing of the rubrics, it's much better if it's done on an examiner or teacher level, because they are the experts. It's just that I need to nudge them in certain directions sometimes. But ultimately, if the work is done there, that's when you build culture, an assessment culture. And then ultimately people stop talking about AACSB or EQUIS. It just becomes the way we do it, right? I mean, the school. And that's when it's most effective, when you don't do it for someone else. You do it because that's the way you do things. And it just so happens that it is relevant for AACSB and EQUIS and anyone else who's knocking on the door, basically.
Okay. One last question on measure, and then I'll pass on to the COVID and how it's going to impact AOL. But we have a question from Eva, who is asking about, let's assume you have 4 learning goals per degree program. How often do you measure each goal? Do you measure every goal every year, every 2 to 3 years, or do you just measure certain goals, not each one?
We measure each and every goal every year. And this is basically because, well, I mean, not because EQUIS wants it or AACSB or anyone else. This demand basically came from our university. So they wanted each and every school to follow up each and every program each year. And when doing that, follow up each program goal. So what we did was said, this is great, because then it's coming from the inside, right? And what we did was that we then tweaked this and added AOL, for example, because no university in Sweden expects a school to have AOL expectation, ILO's expectations as extensive and rigid as AACSB or EQUIS. I mean, they basically, they don't scratch on the surface, but they basically look at the process, and that each school, each university needs to have a quality assurance system. So they look at process. But then the local university here wanted us to, look at each and every program goal each year. So what we did is we said excellence, and then added, we made some add-ons to that will satisfy what we needed to do for AACSB and EQUIS. Meaning again that we create economies of scale. So it would have been much more difficult for us to tell faculty, yeah, AACSB wants us to do it every year. We would have received a lot of protests, but now we actually made use of something coming from, from the university. And now we can get results every year and satisfy expectations from the local university, from AACSB and EQUIS. Again, so I think that's the key, not how much, but how well can we align it with the daily operations, what is asked from us anyway. So I, of course, needed to convince the president of the university, look, you think it's important that we got double accreditation? Well, guess what? This is what we need in order to maintain, reporting lines, or what we need to do. So they allowed us to add that, basically, or add those additional components of the system. And I know there are a lot of schools that struggle with, different reporting lines depending on who knocking on the door. But I think it's important to take a step back and look at how much can we put together. So
your institution just got EQUIS 5 years last year, so you're safe on that side. But you have your AACSB accreditation coming up soon, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
So how do you make sure that AOL is going to be done properly with the COVID crisis?
Well, I know some schools that canceled their entire AOL process this year because of COVID-19. I don't think we will have to do this, and this is partly because what I talked about before. We collect AOL as part of, what we need to do anyway, right? so if COVID-19 had happened back in, before we had academic, before we had more systemized link between people, procedures, and policy, I think we would have focused very much on, more reactive measures, basically, and not AOL measures. But since we have what I think our house is in order, right? So when it comes to QM and in QA, where we try to maintain our operations anyway, and as AOL is part of that now, it wasn't always, but now it is. We will still be able to, weather out the storm when it comes to AOL, and we'll get those results in time for our visit.
Thank you. Question from Amir. Will AOL and ILO's definition and approach change during a post-COVID-19? Can and should we include pandemic impacts on student learning, and what is the best way to balance this with accreditation body expectation and requirements?
Well, pandemic effect. Well, it will be. I don't know the French word, but in English it's act of God, right? So would act of God. How would act of God impact AOL? Well, if you do AOL twice for every program goal in a 5-year accreditation period, then of course it will have a huge impact if it hits that particular year. But I don't think you should build your systems in that way, because then they are really vulnerable. But I think the big question is how will COVID-19 affect learning and teaching? I think that's the big question. How will AOL be affected by that? We are now propelled in a direction where we were making slow progress. How will we look at the different delivery modes that are available and that we started to look at, and now within 1 or 2 weeks needed to rush ourselves into that is on-site, online learning, for example. So how do we deal with AOL when we try to create a good mix of on-site, distance learning, online learning, blended learning? Should the learning be synchronous or asynchronous? That is regardless of particular place and time. And which mix of this is something we should move our business at, in which direction? I think that's a much bigger challenge for learning and teaching overall. We were sort of prompted with the questions that will affect quality long term. So when we make some good decisions on that, a pandemic might not have the same disastrous effects as it may have now on teaching and learning, because we will be less vulnerable to, when everybody's on site and quickly becomes off site, then daily operations need to change quickly to off site. But if we have a different mix and a different preparedness, how to quickly shift to online, the effects of a pandemic will be less disastrous, I think. So I think it calls for some big questions and discussions how we should look at teaching and learning overall, rather than just looking particularly at AOL. And
so for you,
now only thinking out loud, but
yeah, no, but it's great. But for you, so teaching and learning is going to change, as you said it. Like now, all of these courses are fully online. When it go back to normal, being in September or sometime next year, it will have an impact because schools might be more blended, might have more online courses. But for you as quality director, how does that change your work? Like, how are you visualizing that? How are you making adjustments? Because it's a changing world, and you don't really know where the institution is going. You still are waiting for your dean to give you a vision, your associate dean of teaching and learning. So you're still under a lot of expectation from others, and you're waiting for them. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, it's nobody really knows if students going to turn up or not, you know, in the autumn. And we are, like many other, last week I had a meeting with all AACSB and EQUIS-accredited schools in the Nordic region, and everybody is basically planning for on-site, but a preparedness for online. So those are the short-term solutions. We all see already, as people in charge of quality, big challenges in terms of how do we ascertain individual assessment? How do we curb plagiarism, for example? If everybody having take-home exams, how do we ascertain that students plagiarize each other? How will we build systems that will help us with this? How do we deal with challenges to make sure that students meet all ILOs? And since higher education higher education institutions are handling this very differently, both nationally and internationally, how do we know that students coming from abroad or other schools do have the right qualifications with them to, for example, go on a master level, for example? So it leads to a lot of more headache for anybody involved in quality assurance. I think it will be easier once we decide or where we want to invest, you know, because ultimately all these costs for perhaps maintaining on-site and online at the same time, I hope will turn into opportunity costs, because we will develop the material competence among faculty and in programs where we probably will be heading anyway. But again, I mean, it's even more important to have your house in order. So for us then, who have all faculty in a faculty management system, I mean, we have a pretty good view of faculty's competencies in these areas. So because already now we see faculty who are segmenting and recording their learning on course websites. So they already are completely online. At the same time, they are giving online lectures, but of course mentally hope that students will turn up this autumn. So many faculty are doing 3 things at the same time. I mean, or are preparing for 3 different modes of the teaching.
You mentioned.
Sorry. Yeah,
no, please go ahead. You mentioned students. But students, and you mentioned earlier between direct and indirect assessment. At the moment, because of the change from fully on-site to fully online, a lot of students were unhappy because they said, look, I was expecting to be on campus. So some of your measures are going to be affected by that. So what are you going to, what kind of process are you going to put in place to make sure that your quality, maybe it's just because they were unhappy because it passed from on campus to online. Like, are you thinking of process to put in place in order to minimize the impact?
Well, to start with, I author quarterly reports on course evaluations, and when COVID-19 hit Sweden, really, so students had to leave campus. That was at the end of the spring 1. So what I was looking for in the course evaluations of students in spring 1 was how, did we get any reactions to examinations or end of course. I also looked at grading, of course, because if it's problematic to ascertain, student performance, for example, did it reflect in the grading? Because for us, they can still get A, B, C, D, E's and F's, right? So were teachers more inclined to give higher grades? So that's what I've been looking at. And based on early results from spring 1, students are not unhappier than they usually are, during spring 1 with the different courses. There are some instances where they complain about final assessment in examinations. When it comes to grading, I think we're closer to the Bell's curve I'm always looking for than we were last spring. So I of course have to look more carefully into this in spring too, when really students have been forced to study from home. But definitely we need to follow this, and there's going to be a difference also with students who are state funded and who students who pay tuition fees. I know that in Norway, I mean, students on tuition fees, they even started a campaign where they demand to have lowered fees because they were admitted to the schools based on also that they wanted to create a good network, and the networking opportunity is now at best online. So it also brings up some questions. Should we have a lower fees for students who only are taught online, or how do we do it? And here, of course, we can also learn from universities who are completely online. So these are really important questions that are, that are basically unraveled as we speak. Because still, I mean, for the big universities, they are still have a focus on, yes, students will come to campus in August, September. And the decisions on this won't be made, I don't think, until mid-May, at least not in the Nordic countries. So I think the best way is to prepare for bad weather, to be honest,
So another question from Amizan, which is, what is the best way to ensure the quality of teaching and the effectiveness of learning in COVID-19 situation? And how do we stand out in terms of teaching effectiveness of learning provisions in the current situation, given all institutions are adopting similar approach of online/blended learning?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I mean, to be honest, I think we need to start to look at what constitutes a good online course, and how is it different from an on-site course. I don't think, I mean, right now there are a lot of faculty, I think, who are recording entire lectures, and for students and for these what they call Zoomers, I mean, we are, and anybody who hit 30 is a boomer, but for these Zoomers, then their attention span is like 5 minutes, so but I also see some other faculty who segment lectures, topic wise. So I think the best thing you can do is to help your faculty who are now investing a lot of time into changing entire production lines, right? To help them technically and pedagogically, how can you segment the content so it doesn't become a 1.5 hour lecture, but how can you segment it and instead have clips, or short segments that are topic wise that the students can work themselves through. And I think we should focus less on lectures than on seminars. So try to make sure that students really work themselves through the content and the pre-recorded material, and then facilitate discussions with the students. When I look at some good practice among my teachers here at my business school, I mean, the ones who really put a lot of work into exactly this, creating hubs of discussion and seminars, assuming that students have looked through or internalized these different lectures this way. I've seen some very positive results in student evaluations. Whereas for faculty who think, yes, I will basically upload a PowerPoint and then talk and record my voice, just like a regular lecture, I think, well, I've seen that students are not very happy about this because they lose interest, as you would if I were talking for 1 hour instead of then interviewing me. It's the same kind of psychology. And also really make use of what, for example, Zoom can do for you to help faculty to interact with students. So faculty needs to tool up in terms of tech and pedagogy. I think that's important, and that in turn will help learning, right? In terms of assessment challenges, again, I think it's going to be a big challenge to how we particularly ascertain individual assessments. That's also, but again, we will need to have this discussion anyway very soon, right? Because we were moving towards digitalizing and going online with teaching. It's just that we have been now propelled into this and being forced to change the way we do it in a very short period of time. But I think,
and even digitalization, Björn, if I may, digitalization is something that I feel, and I think EQUIS is starting to try to put as one of the key chapter of the EQUIS accreditation, because it's becoming so important that really it is the accreditation body themselves are thinking of putting digitalization as a key part of the accreditation process.
Yeah, I think that's really important that the accreditors are expectations, criteria are updated. So really ask the schools, how do they move in that direction? How do you ascertain individual assessment? How do you work with the various innovative techniques, pedagogies that are solely done online? How do you deal with the challenges in meeting ILOs when you do teaching in a sole online or blended environment? You know, it used to be that you have to go for a particular accreditation, of course, to look into this. You know, now I think we need to make it part of overall institutional accreditations. That might be also part of the new normal.
When we were preparing this session, you said something, and I noted, was moving from COVID-19 to co-EDU 20, yeah. and thinking of recalibrating quality assurance. Would you be able to maybe speak about that a bit?
Well, I try to play with words sometimes. So, I mean, COVID-19 sounds really negative, right? But I think it's important to see the opportunity in this. So how can you go from COVID-19 to co-edu 20? We shouldn't get stuck in, into this. Instead look at, okay, so this will force us into not unknown territory, but where we were moving slowly, but maturing. And for quality assurance systems, it poses a lot of challenges, and the way I thought about it was, it's a great opportunity to make, if you haven't done it before, do an inventory of what kind of quality assurance systems do you have? How do you know your competencies of your faculty? Do you have a faculty management system, for example? Where do you keep this information? Do you have a good database for it? How do you maintain AOL? Do you have a good system for maintaining AOL and also getting quick reports on it? Because now then, not ever, but it's very important for management to have a good basis for decision. I mean, they need good quality and quality assurance data to make good decisions. Meaning that you need systems that can give that you need to have a good knowledge of your faculty, of your students, of your programs, and also try to calibrate these systems so it can deliver good data. So it's a good tooling up opportunity so that you are more ready and agile to the challenges that are coming with what they call new normal. We can probably be quite sure that it's gonna, if not change completely our delivery modes, but at least it will force us to make our production lines, let's call them that, much more agile and perhaps bigger or satisfying different kinds of audiences and needs. So it's good to know where you are, so you can dig where you stand as a business school or university, because that will help you to decide where you are going on this. So that's what I at least will try to do. So that would be my recommendation, of course, to further look at what you're having to see where you can be going. For example, on should you decide on on-site, online, distance, blended, very important decisions that come with concomitant big investments. But then you also need to know your ship and the people who are going there. I mean, your faculty, your students, and you also need to look at what you cover in your curriculum, the kind of knowledge, skills, abilities, competencies that you want to inculcate your students with. It's also important, just as a final word, now when we send out our graduates into the post-COVID world, right? The students who are graduating now. So what kind of world do they end up in? In terms of measures, try to pick up on this quite early. What kind of good jobs do they get? Do they get jobs? So what's the effect of this? So it's a good opportunity to see also how you have tooled them up for this kind of crisis. That's very good data to bring in through QM system to influence your curriculum development. It's a good litmus test.
Well, thank you, Björn. It's 2 p.m., so that's the end of our session today. Thank you, everybody. The next session will be on Wednesday, and we are talking of internationalization with Lena. So we're really looking forward to all of that. Thank you, Björn, for your time. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe and speak soon.